My name is James McLinnis, and I'm here to speak about the signed ordinance, of course. I personally, and millions of other people just like me, consider the First Amendment and the United States Constitution to be the most important thing that separates our country from everybody else. Putin's locking people up right now for protesting the war. He's got a big disinformation campaign. If you try and tell the truth, you get put in jail. And a lot of people look at that and they say, that's terrible, but this city council is doing the exact same thing. You're not like the Wizard of Oz, you're not little Lilliputians, you're little Putins. You have to understand that one of the things that makes this country great is the ability to say what we want to say, when we want to say it, any way we want to say it. And people like you do not have the right to tell us we can't. The Constitution guarantees that. And you worry about you wonder how you got into this big mess. This big mess started several years ago when people started protesting your police that were overly abusive and heavy-handed in what they were doing, and in a lot of ways very corrupt. And people started monitoring that, following that, videotaping them, and seeking public records. When they came to seek public records, you guys all played this Title 10 with Chapter 119, violate their rights by making them pay exorbitant fees for every single record. Every single thing needed to be redacted when it didn't. You withheld records intentionally from these people requesting records. And then, in order for them to enforce the law, Title 10, Chapter 119, they have to sue you. But in order to sue you, they have to prove that you did not give them the records they asked for. And to do that, they needed to videotape asking for the records. So what did you do then? You made it a crime to videotape inside public building. You told people coming to pick up the records that you can't videotape you asking for the records, which is a violation of Title 10, Chapter 119. It's a crime. You can't put a condition on the release of public records, and you did that. And when that wasn't enough, these people got angry and they went out and started protesting. You created the Ian McGuires and the Andrew Sheets of the world by trying to suppress people's rights. And every time you try and do that, it's going to get worse and worse and worse for you. You are going to be sued many more times than this. You're going to cost all these people hundreds of thousands of dollars by your own arrogance. And your attorney, Levine, he sat before you in these meetings and he lied to you, and he told you that Cohen versus California supported it when any idiot could see that that lawsuit was about what you can say on the radio, not what you can say on a public sidewalk. He led you down that dark path because that's what you wanted to hear. The first thing that you should do to straighten out this mess is fire him, because he lied to you. And then after he lied to you, he told you he could support this in court. And then he took all the taxpayers' money to go fight it. And now you're where you are today, and he's still supporting it. You've gotten bad advice from a bad attorney, and you need to do something about that. But the bottom line is, the more you try and squeeze First Amendment, the more it's going to blow up in your face. You don't realize that yet, but what I want to just say, last closing argument, to all of you, and especially to you, Mr. Karski, the I won't back down, fuck you.
Nicole Christian, Port Charlotte. How many citations were given out for sign ordinance violations since certain language was codified as forbidden? Do any of you know?
This is not Q&A.
It's not Q&A. All right. I wonder how many people were jailed as a result of it. On July 27, 2021, the board was advised via email about the necessity of respecting and protecting Americans' right to protest and free speech. What changed your minds to jail people after that? For signs, for political expression in a public forum. I wonder how many on the board have never used the F-bomb in their lives. I know last year one of your members admitted to using it in golf, a game. Why is it okay to use it to play golf, but it's not okay to use it when you're expressing deeply held political beliefs? I wonder why we're forbidding the use of words when the next step would be to use weapons of war. If you can't have a civil discourse, as Thomas Jefferson warned us, if truth is not able to be combated in the public forum, then it leads people to violence. I want to go on record as saying that I think it's a crime to limit the number of political signs that Punta Gorda Americans can put in their own yards to support candidates that they believe in. Thank you for the time.
Thank you.
Morning, my name is Dave Kalin, here to speak on item 8D, which references the sign ordinance. I'd like to start by thanking you for giving the time to speak. Many of you, as elected officials, have taken the oath of office, which is to defend the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. That is the first role of government, is to protect the people under the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. When we look at the sign ordinance and what it has created over the past duration of its enactment, has been just nothing short of shameful. As we move forward, I would encourage each one of you to consider this very carefully, because just 54 short years ago, a black Baptist pastor was assassinated for his political views and free speech. Speech that is now accepted and cherished in our heritage as Americans and African Americans, that we are all equal. Wasn't so just 60 years ago. So I would encourage every one of you to seriously consider, as you move forward with this sign ordinance and what it has done to our community, the divisiveness of it, and let's work to pull ourselves together and not divide. Thank you.
Thank you. State your name for the record, and you will have 3 minutes.
Good morning. My name is Michael Hirsch. I live in Seminole Lakes. I'm here to talk about your essentially repeal of the egregious unconstitutional sign ordinance. It's little comfort to stand here and say, I told you so. I'm really here to say, now what are you going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again? Most of you voted and passed a sign ordinance that was blatantly unconstitutional. You should have known it. The only supporting document I could have brought with me is the Bill of Rights, and that could be displayed up there too. You should have known it, your city manager certainly should have known it, and I'm sure your city attorney knew it. The problem was nobody stood up and said to the council members, you can't do this, it's unconstitutional. So what you essentially did is passed an ordinance that has cost me and everybody else in this room probably upwards of $150,000 to maybe $200,000, maybe more. We need an accounting of what it's cost in not only out-of-pocket costs for attorneys, court fees, police overtime, and enforcing this egregious act. I've been a journalist all my life. I've been in radio and television the past 20-some years as an author. My livelihood depends on the First Amendment. You people didn't just bump it. You ran it over, backed up and ran it over again. It was a Kyle Schwarber 492-foot out of the park, no doubter. The question is, what are you going to do to keep from doing that again? I need you to say that you will empower your city attorney not to be in fear for his job, same for your city manager, but to stand up in public at a city council meeting and say, don't do that. It will cost the citizens of this city a lot of money. It's blatantly unconstitutional. It will embarrass Punta Gorda nationwide. You can't just sit there and vote for it and ho-hum and walk around and say, well, we had to do it because people were asking us to do it. Mr. Levin and our city manager, you need to stand up and say, don't do that. And the city council needs to empower them to do that and know that they won't be held in fear of their jobs if they actually do that. The First Amendment is just about as important, more important than anything we could possibly be dealing with. You need to respect it.
For the record, my name is Louis LaBarbera, and to speak on the unconstitutional sign ordinance, how are we going to keep that from happening again? And what are we going to do for the people that were negatively impacted? For example, Andrew Sheets, who was fined up to $5,000 due to this unconstitutional ordinance, and a lien was put onto his house. He lost business, and his name was defamed multiple times. What are we going to do to keep that from happening again? It has been brought to multiple people's attention that was blatantly unconstitutional, whether it's to the council, to the police, and nobody did anything about it. until Andrew Sheets took it to court. It's free speech. That's my supporting document will be the Constitution of the United States of America, the First Amendment, freedom of speech. What is in that ordinance had nothing to do with fighting words. It had nothing to do with inciting violence. It was blatantly unconstitutional freedom of speech. What are you going to do to keep it from happening again? That's what the people need to know. Because remember, you all took an oath and the police took an oath to serve the people. You need to let the people know how you're going to keep this unconstitutionalities from happening again to where it affects the people, especially someone like Andrew Sheets. He won his state trial, and his federal case is about to be settled. And he was even arrested for free speech on public property. How are you going to keep that from happening again?
Okay, the next item on the agenda is the city attorney memo on the city sign code.
Yes, Mayor and Council, I have purposefully kept my comments regarding the circuit court judge's decision short because I was certain that some would perceive them as sour grapes. But given the fact that the integrity of the city council and city attorney was challenged this morning, I have a couple of comments I'd like to make. First, to answer some questions. There were only two people who were brought before the city council, city's code enforcement board with respect to the violations of the city's sign code. No one was arrested by the city for violation of the city's sign code. There were arrests made by Charlotte County for reasons other than violations of our sign code. Also, to dispel the conspiracy theory that was presented this morning, the genesis of our sign code revisions was actually a U.S. Supreme Court decision, Reed versus Town of Gilbert, Arizona. In that decision, the U.S. Supreme Court found an ordinance that was substantially similar to the city's sign code as being violative of the First Amendment because it was predominantly content-based restrictions on speech. I had advocated to the City Council for a number of years following the Supreme Court's decision in that case of the need to amend the city's sign code to be consistent with the finding of the U.S. Supreme Court regarding the content neutrality of our ordinance. In the course of developing the city's sign code, there were certain instances of use of indecent speech and questions whether or not the city could constitutionally regulate the indecent speech that was appearing on flags and other signs following the presidential election. After doing a substantial amount of legal research on the issue, I relied upon a U.S. Supreme Court decision in Pacifica Foundation versus FCC, which was a case where the Pacifica Foundation owned radio stations, one of which broadcast a political satire monologue by comedian George Carlin, utilizing a number of the quote-unquote dirty words, as he used it and as the Supreme Court recognized them, in a radio broadcast that could be heard by children under the age of 17. It was broadcast during the day. And the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the findings of the Federal Communications Commission that the broadcast of indecent speech, as they were defined by the FCC, was constitutional, given the fact that it was intended to protect children from exposure to such indecent language. I was also familiar and researched what was widely quoted and still is today, a U.S. Supreme Court decision in a California case called Cohen versus California. In that case, Cohen was wearing a jacket in a courthouse which had F the draft. And of course, it was the full word that was used, not the abbreviation. That case was actually a case where the local jurisdiction cited and convicted Cohen of disturbing the peace. It was not a sign code case. It was not a case anything but disturbance of the peace. And the U.S. Supreme Court decided in that case that the use of the F word without anything further was not disturbance of the peace. When this court, and based upon the precedents not only of those two cases but other cases that I researched very thoroughly, I presented an ordinance which defined indecent speech in the same fashion as it was defined by the FCC in the Pacific Foundation case, which was upheld as constitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. When this case went to court, before the circuit court, locally, the judge considered the precedent established by the U.S. Supreme Court in Cohen versus California, and also considered the precedent of the U.S. Supreme Court in Pacifica Foundation versus FCC, and notwithstanding the fact that the Cohen case was not a sign case and was a disturbance of the peace case, the local judge determined that our ordinance, as related to indecent speech, was, and even though recognizing that it was intended to protect children under the age of 17, the judge determined that our case was, our sign code was in violation of the precedent established in the Cohen case and others, rejecting the U.S. Supreme Court's decision as precedent in the Pacifica versus FCC case, and indicated that our ordinance, with respect to the indecent speech language, our sign code, was unconstitutional. He nowhere determined that it was blatantly unconstitutional. He determined that it was unconstitutional. And I didn't struggle. I advised the city council that it was probably in the best interest of the city council not to take an appeal of the circuit court judge's decision because of the uncertainty of what our U.S. Supreme Court currently might say with respect to our case, given the fact that reliance upon precedent may not be enough to sustain the decision, the ordinance that we had put forward. So I have made the recommendation to the City Council to amend the ordinance to take out the language as it relates to indecent speech, to take out the language as it relates to fighting words, and to take out the language as it relates to obscene speech, so that there would be no further challenges of our ordinance as it relates to violations of free speech. But I do want to note, notwithstanding what others might say, it has been absolutely found by the U.S. Supreme Court that the freedom of speech is not absolute. We are well familiar with exceptions to, and content-based exceptions to the First Amendment. Stating false statements under oath, perjury, is an exception to the right of free speech. Slander and libel is an exception to free speech. There's a whole host of other well understood classifications of speech that are considered to be exceptions to the First Amendment's right of free speech. And as I had researched the case law, and again, relying predominantly on the Pacifica Foundation versus FCC case, which it intended to address the same concerns we had when we adopted our ordinance, recognized indecent speech as an exception to the right of free speech. So my recommendation before the City Council today is to authorize me to draft an ordinance for your consideration that would delete the fighting words, indecent speech, and obscene language provisions from our code. Thank you.
Any questions? Debbie?
David, would this still prohibit the reprehensible activity that went on outside in front of the school? Or are those signs also protected by free speech?
All right. So I was not and am not directly involved in that case, but it was my understanding that that Mr. Sheets was cited for things that were not directly related to the sign language on the sign itself. It was his behavior that caused the sheriff's office to enforce their codes, not the city's sign code.
Okay.
Jaha?
I had problems with this shortly after it was passed because, like David said, that the purpose of this was actually to ameliorate, to create a content-neutral code based on our past code. The issues I saw was that I found that some of our members were actually using the code then as a way to actually openly basically say to restrict speech. I don't like seeing this sign, I don't like seeing this shirt. And I found that once we added the intent behind it, that actually then I did see it as becoming restricting of speech. But I didn't say anything because it was going to litigation, so I just waited until it was done. But I am happy we're here because I do feel that in the air there is some intent to restrict speech through this, and so I think it's better we take that language out of the code.
Anyone else? Okay, so if we were to accept the proposed amendment, then we'd have to bring that back to council?
Yeah.
And will it have to go back to Planning Commission or anyone else before it comes to us?
Well, it would not need to come back before the Planning Commission, but the procedure has always been that before we present to you an ordinance for adoption, that we present it to you, the text or the concept for your discussion and then determination as to whether you would authorize the preparation of the ordinance. So pursuant to that policy, that's what I've put on the agenda today, and again would request your authorization to prepare an ordinance that would come back before you, amending the code as I provided in my memo.
Okay. Does anyone want to make a motion to that effect?
I'll make a motion.
Second.
Do we have a second?
Yes, second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to have the city attorney draft official documentation for a proposed amendment to the sign code. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you.